He thought it would be a harmless joke, a moment of entertainment for his class. But Professor Daniel Harrington had no idea he was about to dismantle his own reputation in front of everyone who admired him. The lecture hall at Westbridge University buzzed with quiet anticipation, rows of polished wooden desks filled with graduate students clutching notebooks and tablets, each one eager to impress the man at the front of the room. Harrington stood tall beneath the soft glow of overhead lights, his tailored navy suit sharp against the chalkboard behind him, where a dense, intimidating calculus problem stretched across nearly 4 feet of space, symbols layered upon symbols like a fortress no one dared to challenge. His reputation was legendary, a brilliant mind with little patience for those he deemed unworthy, and this morning, his sharp eyes scanned the room with the same quiet judgment that had silenced countless voices before. Near the back, almost blending into the wall, sat Emily Carter, her gray cardigan slightly worn at the sleeves, her posture modest, her presence almost invisible to those around her. At 39, she was older than most in the room, and while others whispered theories and compared notes, Emily simply observed, her pen resting still in her hand, her gaze lingering on the board just a second longer than anyone noticed. She had taken the seat deliberately, a place where expectations were low and attention was minimal, exactly where she preferred to be. Harrington turned toward the class, tapping the chalk lightly against his palm, the faint echo cutting through the room. "This," he said, gesturing toward the equation, "is a problem that has challenged even experienced mathematicians. I don't expect anyone here to solve it." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, tension disguised as humor, and Harrington allowed himself a thin smile, clearly pleased with the atmosphere he controlled so effortlessly. Then his gaze drifted again, scanning, calculating, until it landed on Emily. There was a pause, subtle but deliberate, as if he had just found something mildly amusing. "You," he said, pointing casually with the chalk, in the gray cardigan. "Why don't you come up and give it a try?" The room shifted instantly, heads turning, whispers sparking like static electricity. Emily blinked once, surprised but composed, her fingers tightening slightly around her pen before she set it down. A few students exchanged smirks. Others leaned back in their chairs, already anticipating the outcome, the quiet woman at the back becoming the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Harrington's expression remained calm, but there was a glint in his eyes, the unmistakable satisfaction of a man orchestrating a moment he believed he fully controlled. "Don't worry," he added, his tone light but edged with condescension. "This is just for fun." Laughter followed, louder this time, more confident, filling the air with a sense of collective superiority. Emily rose slowly, smoothing the front of her cardigan, her movements measured, almost careful, as if each step carried a weight no one else could see. The sound of her shoes against the polished floor echoed softly as she made her way down the aisle, every eye fixed on her, every expectation already written. And yet, as she approached the board, something subtle shifted, something almost imperceptible, the way her gaze lifted, the way her shoulders settled, the way the noise behind her seemed to fade into a distant hum. Harrington handed her the chalk with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Take your time," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. Emily accepted the chalk without a word, her fingers steady now, her attention locked onto the equation in front of her. For a brief moment, the room held its breath, suspended between amusement and curiosity, unaware that the quietest person in the room was about to change everything. And in that stillness, just before the first line was written, something unspoken passed through the air, a shift so quiet it almost went unnoticed, but powerful enough to silence the room before a single answer appeared. Emily stood before the board, the chalk resting lightly between her fingers as her eyes traced every symbol, every variable, every hidden pattern woven into the equation that had intimidated an entire room of advanced students. Behind her, the faint rustle of shifting bodies and suppressed laughter lingered, but it no longer reached her in the same way. The world seemed to narrow, the noise dissolving into a distant hum as her focus sharpened with quiet precision. Professor Harrington folded his arms, leaning slightly against the desk, his expression calm but expectant, the look of a man who believed he already knew how this moment would end. A student near the front whispered something under his breath, prompting a few quiet chuckles, and someone else muttered, "This is going to be painful," barely attempting to hide their amusement. Emily did not turn around. She did not acknowledge them. Instead, she lifted the chalk and made her first mark. It was a simple stroke, deliberate and steady, the kind of movement that did not belong to hesitation. A few students straightened in their seats, their expressions shifting ever so slightly, though no one said a word. Harrington's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, as he watched her write the opening transformation, a step that was not incorrect, but not the approach he expected either. Emily continued, her hand moving with measured confidence, each line flowing into the next with a rhythm that felt almost practiced, almost familiar, as if she had walked this path many times before. The room began to quiet, not because anyone asked it to, but because something subtle had changed. The laughter faded first, then the whispers, until all that remained was the soft, steady sound of chalk against the board. A young man in the second row leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he tried to follow her logic, flipping quickly through his notes, as if searching for something he might have missed. Another student glanced toward Harrington, expecting interruption, correction, anything that would restore the balance they were used to, but none came. Harrington remained still, his gaze fixed on the board, his confidence beginning to shift into something less certain, something he did not immediately recognize. Emily paused for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but as if recalculating, refining, then continued, adjusting a variable in a way that simplified the entire structure of the problem. A quiet murmur moved through the room, no longer mocking, but curious, almost cautious. The equation that had once stretched across the board like an impenetrable wall was beginning to change, its complexity unraveling under her hand, revealing a path that had been there all along but overlooked by everyone else. Harrington straightened slightly, pushing himself away from the desk, his eyes scanning her work more carefully now, searching for an error, a flaw, anything that would confirm his original assumption. But each step held. Each transformation was precise, intentional, and unmistakably correct. Emily's breathing remained even, her posture relaxed, as if the pressure that filled the room had never belonged to her in the first place. She was not performing. She was not proving anything. She was simply solving. Another line, then another, and suddenly the equation that had taken up nearly 4 feet of space had condensed into something elegant, something clear, something that made the entire room rethink what they had been looking at just minutes before. A student in the back whispered, "Wait, that actually works," his voice carrying just enough to be heard, followed by a stunned silence that felt heavier than any laughter before it. Harrington took a step closer, his polished shoes echoing softly against the floor, his expression no longer composed but searching, uncertain, as if he were witnessing something that did not fit within the boundaries he had carefully built over years of authority. Emily did not look at him. She did not look at anyone. She simply continued, her hand steady, her mind already several steps ahead, as the final pieces of the solution began to fall into place with a quiet inevitability that no one in that room had expected. The final lines began to take shape under Emily's hand, each symbol placed with quiet certainty, each transformation closing the distance between impossibility and clarity, and with every movement, the atmosphere in the room shifted further away from skepticism into something far more fragile, something that resembled disbelief. A student in the front row slowly lowered his pen, no longer pretending to take notes, his eyes fixed entirely on the board as if afraid that blinking might cause him to miss something important. Another leaned forward so far that his chair creaked softly beneath him, his earlier confidence replaced by a silent urgency to understand how the woman they had dismissed minutes ago was navigating a problem that none of them had dared to attempt. Emily stepped slightly to the side, her gaze scanning the equation not with doubt, but with refinement, as if she were polishing something already complete rather than searching for what came next. Professor Harrington moved closer now, no longer observing from a distance, his presence tightening as he studied each line with increasing intensity, his mind racing through the logic, testing it, challenging it, and finding, to his growing unease, that it held. He opened his mouth slightly, as if preparing to interrupt, to reclaim control of the room with a correction or a critique, but no words came. There was nothing to challenge. Emily lifted the chalk once more and added the final transformation, a subtle but decisive step that brought the entire equation together in a way that was not only correct, but unexpectedly elegant. The solution did not just exist, it made sense, in a way that felt almost obvious now that it was complete, and that realization spread through the room like a quiet wave. Someone near the back whispered, that is actually right," the words carrying more weight than any laughter that had come before. Emily set the chalk down gently on the ledge beneath the board, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the silence that followed. She stepped back, not dramatically, not seeking attention, simply creating space between herself and the work she had just completed. For a moment, no one moved. The room, once filled with whispers and judgment, now held a stillness so complete it felt deliberate, as if everyone present had silently agreed to acknowledge what had just happened without yet knowing how to respond to it. Harrington stared at the board, his eyes moving rapidly from one line to the next, retracing every step, searching again for an error that refused to reveal itself. His expression shifted, slowly, almost imperceptibly, from authority to uncertainty, from certainty to something far more human, something that could not be easily concealed. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from the equation, as though touching it might somehow change what he was seeing, but he stopped short, his fingers curling slightly before dropping back to his side. Emily remained calm, her posture unchanged, her attention no longer fixed on the board, but not yet turned toward the audience either. She was not waiting for approval. She was not expecting applause. She simply stood there, present, composed, as if this moment belonged to everyone else more than it belonged to her. A student in the middle row shook his head slowly, almost in disbelief, while another let out a quiet breath he had not realized he had been holding. The shift was complete now. What had begun as a spectacle had become something else entirely, something that no one in that room had prepared for. And as the silence stretched just a little longer, it became clear that the real impact of what Emily had done was not just in the answer she had written, but in the assumptions she had quietly dismantled along the way. No one spoke at first, not because they did not want to, but because no one seemed to know how to begin. The silence that followed Emily's final step was no longer the silence of anticipation or quiet judgment, but something heavier, something that carried the weight of realization. Professor Harrington remained still for another second, then another, his eyes still locked on the board, as though the answer might somehow rearrange itself if he looked long enough. It did not. The solution held firm, unshaken, undeniable. A faint sound broke through the stillness, a chair shifting somewhere near the center of the room, followed by the soft clearing of a throat. But even those small noises felt out of place against the quiet that had settled over everything. Harrington finally straightened, his posture no longer as effortless as it had been moments ago, and turned slowly toward Emily. His expression carefully controlled, but not quite masking the change that had taken place beneath it. "That," he began, his voice measured, though lacking the sharp edge it once carried, "is an interesting approach." The words hung in the air, insufficient, almost fragile, as if they were searching for strength that was no longer there. A few students exchanged glances, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty, as though they were waiting for something more definitive, some authoritative statement that would restore the familiar order of things. Emily met his gaze briefly, her expression calm, neither proud nor defensive, simply present. She did not rush to explain, did not attempt to justify her method. She had already said everything she needed to say on the board. Harrington stepped closer again, this time not as a figure of authority, but as a man trying to understand what had just happened in his own classroom. He gestured lightly toward one section of the equation. "This substitution," he said, his tone quieter now, more analytical than dismissive. "It is not the conventional path." Emily nodded once, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "No, it is not," she replied, her words simple, direct, without hesitation. Another pause followed, shorter this time, but just as significant. Harrington studied her for a moment, as if recalibrating his understanding, not just of the problem, but of the person standing in front of him. "And yet," he added, almost to himself, "it works." A low murmur rippled through the room, no longer filled with mockery, but with recognition. The students were no longer watching a performance. They were witnessing a correction, not just of a solution, but of perspective. One of the graduate students in the front row raised his hand halfway, then lowered it again, unsure if the usual rules still applied. Another flipped back through his notes with renewed urgency, trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with what he had just seen. Harrington exhaled slowly, a subtle release of tension that had gone unnoticed until now, and stepped back, creating a small distance between himself and Emily. It was not dramatic, not obvious, but it was enough to shift the balance of the room. "You may return to your seat," he said finally, his voice even, though something within it had undeniably changed. There was no trace of humor now, no hint of condescension. Emily inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words, and turned without hesitation, walking back down the aisle with the same quiet composure she had carried to the front. This time, no one laughed. No one whispered. The room parted for her in silence, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to respect. As she reached her seat and sat down, the stillness remained, lingering just a moment longer than expected, as if the room itself needed time to adjust. Harrington turned back to the board, his gaze lingering on the solution, and for the first time that morning, he did not rush to speak. He simply stood there, looking, as the weight of what had just occurred settled fully into place, leaving behind a question that no equation could easily answer. The silence did not break immediately after Emily returned to her seat. It lingered, stretching across the lecture hall like a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had just taken place. Professor Harrington remained facing the board, his eyes tracing the solution again, slower this time, not searching for mistakes anymore, but trying to understand the thinking behind it, the choices, the precision, the confidence that had reshaped a problem he himself had presented as nearly untouchable. The chalk marks were still fresh, sharp against the dark surface, each line a quiet contradiction to everything he had implied only minutes before. A student near the aisle shifted in his seat, glancing from the board to Emily and back again, as if trying to reconcile the two images, the quiet woman in a simple gray cardigan and the mind that had just outperformed an entire room of advanced scholars. No one resumed writing. No one raised a hand. The usual rhythm of the class had been disrupted, replaced by something far less predictable. Harrington finally turned, not abruptly, but with a measured motion that suggested he was choosing his next words carefully, something he was not accustomed to doing. "Mathematics," he began, his voice steady but noticeably different in tone, "is not only about finding the correct answer, but about the path taken to reach it." The statement sounded familiar, something he had likely said many times before, but today it carried a different weight, as if he were hearing it for the first time himself. His gaze moved across the room, briefly meeting the eyes of several students who quickly looked away, then stopping, almost inevitably, on Emily. She sat quietly, her hands resting on her notebook, her expression unchanged, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Harrington held that gaze a moment longer than expected, then looked away, exhaling softly before continuing. "What we witnessed just now," he said, choosing each word with care, "was an unconventional method that demonstrates a level of understanding that goes beyond memorization." The room remained silent, but the energy within it shifted again, this time toward reflection. A student in the front row nodded slightly, almost unconsciously, while another leaned back, his earlier confidence replaced by something more thoughtful. Harrington walked slowly along the front of the room, no longer commanding attention through authority, but holding it through the gravity of the moment. "There are," he continued, "many ways to approach a problem, but very few people are willing to challenge the assumptions that define those approaches." His voice softened slightly, not losing strength, but gaining something else, something closer to humility. He paused near the edge of the desk, his hand resting lightly against its surface, and for a brief second, the room felt less like a place of instruction and more like a space of realization. Emily did not move. She did not look up. She simply listened, as she had from the beginning, her presence unchanged, her role in the moment quietly complete. A student finally raised his hand, hesitantly, as if unsure whether the normal rules applied again. Harrington noticed, nodded once, and allowed him to speak. "Professor," the student began, his voice careful, Was that method something we should study? The question hung in the air, simple but loaded with implication. Harrington considered it, his eyes briefly returning to the board, then back to the student. Yes, he said after a moment. It is something you should understand. Another pause followed, shorter now, but meaningful. Because understanding does not come from repetition alone, he added. It comes from seeing what others overlook. The room absorbed his words in silence, but this time, it was not an empty silence. It was filled with thought, with recalibration, with the quiet recognition that the hierarchy they had assumed was no longer as solid as it had seemed. And at the back of the room, where expectations had once been lowest, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had been at the start, unnoticed by most, but no longer underestimated by anyone who had been paying attention. The class did not return to normal after that moment. Even as the minutes passed, and Professor Harrington resumed speaking, the familiar structure of the lecture felt altered, as though something invisible had shifted beneath the surface and refused to settle back into place. Students who had once been quick to speak now hesitated, choosing their words more carefully, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the back of the room where Emily sat, not seeking attention, not acknowledging the quiet shift she had created, but undeniably at the center of it. Harrington moved through the remainder of the material with precision, but there was a noticeable restraint in his tone, a subtle recalibration in the way he presented each concept, as though he were now aware that authority alone was no longer enough to define the boundaries of understanding. When the lecture finally came to an end, the sound of chairs moving and bags being gathered filled the room, but even that felt different, less hurried, more deliberate. Conversations began in low voices, not the usual confident exchanges of solutions and strategies, but quieter discussions, thoughtful, reflective, filled with a kind of curiosity that had not been there before. A group of students near the front leaned close together, one of them flipping through his notes, pointing at sections of the equation that now seemed incomplete without the perspective Emily had introduced. "Did you see how she restructured the variable?" One of them whispered, his tone more impressed than skeptical. "That was not in any of the material we covered." Another nodded slowly, still trying to process it. It was like she saw the whole thing differently. Across the room, a few students glanced toward Emily, as if considering whether to approach her, but none moved forward, held back by a mixture of hesitation and the unfamiliar feeling of not knowing how to address someone they had so recently dismissed. Emily, meanwhile, gathered her notebook with the same quiet efficiency she had shown at the beginning, slipping it into her bag without urgency, without any sign that she expected acknowledgement or recognition. She stood, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, and for a brief moment, her eyes lifted toward the board, taking in the equation one last time, not with pride, but with a quiet sense of completion. As she turned to leave, Professor Harrington called out, his voice not loud, but clear enough to carry across the room. "Ms. Carter." The movement in the room slowed, conversations pausing as attention shifted once more. Emily stopped, turning slightly, her expression composed as she met his gaze. Harrington stepped forward, no longer behind the safety of the podium, but standing openly, as if acknowledging that the space between them had changed. "I would like a word, if you have a moment," he said, his tone respectful, stripped of the condescension that had defined it earlier. A few students exchanged surprised glances, the shift not lost on them. Emily nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and waited as the remaining students filtered out, their curiosity lingering in the air like a question no one dared to ask aloud. The door closed softly behind the last student, leaving the room quieter than it had been all morning, but not in the same way as before. This silence was different, more focused, more intentional. Harrington took a few steps closer, stopping at a comfortable distance, his posture relaxed but attentive. For a moment, he did not speak, as if choosing his words with care, something he had not needed to do earlier. "That was not a standard approach," he said finally, his voice steady, but carrying a genuine curiosity now. Emily held his gaze, her expression unchanged, her presence calm and grounded. "No," she replied simply. Another pause followed, not uncomfortable, but filled with the quiet recognition that this conversation was no longer about a classroom exercise. Harrington studied her for a moment longer, then asked the question that had been forming since the first line she wrote. Where did you learn to think like that? The room seemed to hold its breath again, not with an audience this time, but with the weight of a truth that had yet to be spoken. Emily did not answer immediately, and in that brief pause, something deeper than hesitation filled the space between them, something that felt like a boundary being quietly considered rather than a question being avoided. Professor Harrington remained still, his attention fixed on her with a patience that had not existed earlier that day, no longer demanding an answer, but waiting for one with a kind of respect that had been earned rather than assumed. Emily's eyes shifted slightly, not away from him, but inward for a moment, as if she were choosing not just what to say, but how much to reveal. I studied, she said finally, her voice calm and even, offering just enough to acknowledge the question without fully satisfying it. Harrington tilted his head slightly, absorbing the simplicity of the response, recognizing immediately that it was both true and incomplete. That much is clear, he replied, his tone measured, though now carrying a trace of curiosity that bordered on admiration. But that level of understanding does not come from casual study. Emily's expression did not change, but there was a faint shift in her gaze, something quieter, more reflective, as though his words had touched on something real, something she had long ago chosen not to explain. It does not, she agreed softly. Another pause followed, this one heavier, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that there was more beneath the surface, more than either of them was saying out loud. Harrington took a slow breath, his posture relaxing slightly, the rigid authority he once carried now replaced by something more grounded, more human. You are not enrolled in this program, he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization forming in real time. Emily gave a small shake of her head. No, I am not. And yet, he continued, his eyes briefly flicking toward the board, you approach that problem with a level of clarity that many here have not reached despite years of formal training. The words were not exaggerated, not performative, but factual, and in their simplicity, they carried more weight than any praise. Emily glanced toward the board as well, her gaze resting on the equation not with pride, but with quiet familiarity. Understanding does not always follow the same path, she said, her voice steady, her tone neither defensive nor boastful. Harrington watched her closely, as if trying to map her words to the person he had misjudged only an hour earlier. No, he admitted, almost to himself, it does not. The room felt smaller now, more intimate, the distance between teacher and student replaced by something less defined, something that did not fit neatly into titles or roles. Harrington hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Why are you here?" It was a simple question, but it carried layers, curiosity mixed with something else, something closer to humility. Emily's gaze softened slightly, not in vulnerability, but in honesty. To learn, she said. The answer was straightforward, but it did not diminish the depth behind it. Harrington studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, as if accepting something he had not expected to confront that day. Then I would suggest, he said carefully, that you consider enrolling. The offer was not casual, not extended lightly, and the weight of it hung quietly in the air. Emily did not respond right away. She held his gaze, her expression thoughtful, as if weighing not the offer itself, but everything it represented. After a moment, she gave a small, polite nod, acknowledging his words without committing to them. I will consider it, she said. Harrington nodded once in return, understanding that her answer was not dismissal, but deliberation. Another silence settled between them, but this one felt different, not uncertain, not tense, but complete in its own way. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag again, her posture returning to its quiet composure. Thank you, Harrington added, almost as an afterthought, though the sincerity in his voice made it clear that it was not. Emily paused briefly, then inclined her head in acknowledgement before turning toward the door. As she walked away, her steps steady and unhurried, Harrington remained where he stood, watching her leave, the image of her solution still vivid in his mind. And in that moment, it became clear that what had changed that day was not just the outcome of a single problem, but the way he would see every quiet presence that entered his classroom from that point forward. The hallway outside the lecture hall felt brighter than it had that morning, though nothing about the lighting had changed, and as Emily stepped through the doors, The quiet hum of campus life resumed around her, students moving in small groups, conversations overlapping, footsteps echoing against polished floors. She blended into it effortlessly, just another figure among many, her presence once again unnoticed by most. Yet the ripple she had left behind inside that classroom had not followed her out. It stayed, settling into the minds of those who had witnessed it. Inside, Professor Harrington remained standing near the front of the room long after Emily had gone, his gaze still drawn occasionally to the board, to the solution that had rewritten more than just an equation. He reached for the chalk, hesitated, then set it back down without making a single mark, as though unwilling to disturb what had been left there. Later that afternoon, the conversations that had begun in whispers grew into something more tangible, spreading beyond the classroom into study groups and quiet corners of the campus library. Students who had once spoken with certainty now questioned their own approaches, revisiting problems they thought they understood, searching for alternative paths, wondering what else they might have overlooked. One student sat at a table surrounded by open textbooks, staring at a familiar equation, then slowly erasing his previous work, starting again, this time considering not just what he had been taught, but what he had seen. Across campus, another group gathered around a whiteboard, debating the method Emily had used, their voices no longer dismissive, but engaged, curious, almost energized by the challenge of thinking differently. And in the days that followed, something subtle began to change in Professor Harrington's classroom. It was not immediate, not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. He asked more questions than before, not just for answers, but for reasoning, for perspective. He paused longer when students spoke, listening in a way that suggested he was no longer measuring them against a fixed standard, but trying to understand how they arrived at their conclusions. The sharp edge of his tone softened, not completely, but enough that students noticed, enough that the room felt less like a place of judgment and more like a place of exploration. And then, one morning, as the class settled into their seats, a quiet shift occurred that no one announced, but everyone felt. Harrington wrote a new problem on the board, just as complex as the last, just as intimidating, and for a moment, the room held that familiar tension. He turned, scanning the room, his gaze moving from one student to another, but this time, there was no hint of selection for amusement, no trace of condescension. Instead, there was something else, something measured, something intentional. His eyes passed over the front rows, then the middle, before finally resting once more near the back, where Emily had once sat. The seat was empty. A brief pause followed, almost imperceptible, before he looked away, continuing without comment, but the absence lingered, quiet and noticeable. Some students glanced back at that empty seat, as if expecting it to be filled at any moment, as if the memory of what had happened there had given it a kind of presence all its own. The lecture continued, but the room was not the same, not anymore. And somewhere beyond the walls of that building, moving, through the rhythm of her own life without recognition or announcement, Emily Carter carried nothing of what she had left behind, no need to revisit it, no need to claim it. Because for her, it had never been about proving anything at all. It had simply been about understanding. And that, as the room had finally begun to realize, was something far more powerful than anyone had expected. Weeks passed, and the memory of that single morning did not fade as quickly as anyone expected. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something lasting, reshaping the way questions were asked, the way answers were received, and the way silence itself was understood within those walls. Professor Harrington found himself pausing more often now, not out of uncertainty, but out of consideration, giving space for thought rather than filling every moment with authority. The board still filled with complex equations, still challenged even the strongest students. But there was a subtle difference in how those challenges were presented, less as tests of worth and more as invitations to explore. The students, too, had changed, not dramatically, but undeniably. They listened differently, not just to the professor, but to each other, and sometimes, in the middle of a discussion, a quiet voice would offer an unexpected perspective, and instead of dismissal, there would be a pause, a moment of genuine attention, as though everyone had learned that understanding could come from places they had once overlooked. The empty seat near the back of the room remained unclaimed for a long time, no one choosing it, not out of avoidance, but out of respect, as if it had become more than just a place, as if it held a memory that did not need to be disturbed. Harrington noticed it often, his gaze lingering there for just a fraction longer than anywhere else, a silent acknowledgement of the moment that had shifted everything. One afternoon, after class had ended and the room had emptied once again, he stood alone at the board, looking at a problem he had written earlier that day. He picked up the chalk, then stopped, considering not just the solution, but the path, the possibilities he might not have seen before. Slowly, almost thoughtfully, he erased a portion of his own work and began again, this time exploring a different approach, one that felt unfamiliar, but not incorrect. The chalk moved more slowly than it once had, each line considered, each step deliberate, and for the first time in a long while, the process itself seemed to matter more than the result. Across campus, life continued as it always did. Lectures, assignments, conversations, the steady rhythm of learning and ambition, and somewhere within that rhythm, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had always been, moving quietly through her days, unnoticed by most, unrecognized by those who passed her in hallways or sat beside her in shared spaces. She did not return to that lecture hall, did not seek out acknowledgement or opportunity, and yet, what she had done there continued to exist, not as a story to be told, but as a shift that could not be undone. For those who had witnessed it, the memory did not come with noise or spectacle, but with something far more powerful, a quiet reminder that certainty is not the same as truth, and that the ability to see differently is often hidden behind the simplest appearances. And in the stillness of that understanding, something lasting took root, not just in the classroom, but in the minds of those who had been willing to see beyond what they expected. Because on that ordinary morning, without raising her voice,